Revenge office stories. The boardroom smelled of cheap coffee and raw ambition, a stale, suffocating scent. They were gathered, like vultures, ready to pick the company's bones clean. They thought the CEO's death was their golden ticket. This emergency meeting was nothing more than a corporate takeover, a thinly veiled coronation for the most ruthless snake in the room. But they didn't know that I was the emergency, and I was about to walk in with the CEO's final word, her will. They thought they were deciding the company's future. They had no idea the future was about to walk right through the door. Eleanor Vance wasn't just the CEO of Innovate Dynamics. She was its architect, its soul. I met her 22 years ago when I was a junior programmer fresh out of college, armed with a head full of theories and zero clue how the real world actually worked. My first big project went down in flames. I mean, a spectacular failure. A cascade of coding errors that brought an entire internal server crashing down. I was convinced I was getting fired. I was sitting at my desk, packing my sad little box of personal belongings when she just appeared. She didn't yell. She didn't even look disappointed. She just pulled up a chair, glanced at the mess of code on my screen, and said, "All right, let's debug this thing. Every mistake is just a lesson you haven't paid for yet. Lucky for you, this one's on the house." That was Eleanor. Over the next 2 decades, she wasn't just my boss. She was my mentor. She taught me that leadership wasn't about wielding power, but about empowering people. She believed in people, not assets. And she built a culture of loyalty by being fiercely loyal herself. Innovate Dynamics wasn't some cold corporate machine. It was a collective, a family, held together by her vision. I rose through the ranks under her guidance, eventually becoming the head of research and development. I wasn't just an employee, I was her confidant. I was the one she called when she needed an honest opinion, not the sycophantic praise she got in the boardroom. And the boardroom, that was a different world entirely. A necessary evil she had to manage, a den of politics and egos. The most venomous snake in that den was Richard Sterling, the board's chairman. Richard was everything Eleanor wasn't. Where she saw potential, he saw profit margins. Where she saw people, he saw headcounts. He'd slithered onto the board through a merger years ago and had been a thorn in her side ever since. He called her people-first approach a quaint philosophy that was holding the company back from aggressive growth, his pet phrase for stripping it for parts and selling off whatever was valuable. He never had the votes to oust her. Her results spoke for themselves, and her sheer force of will kept the other board members in line. But he was patient. He played the long game, slowly building alliances with other corporate predators on the board, like Janice Croft from finance and Marcus Thorne from legal. They all believed a company was just a vehicle for getting rich. They hated Eleanor's leadership and were just biding their time, waiting for any sign of weakness. Eleanor knew. I remember the late-night calls where she'd vent her frustration. "They're circling Alex," she'd say, her voice tired but firm. "They think this place is just numbers on a spreadsheet. They don't get that if you rip out the heart, the whole body dies." I always told her she was untouchable, that her legacy was secure. I believed it. We all did. We never imagined a world, let alone a company, without Eleanor at the helm. We were so wrong. The news of her heart attack hit us like an earthquake. It was a Tuesday morning. The day started like any other and ended with the world feeling fundamentally broken. 1 minute, she was prepping for a keynote speech. The next, she was gone. The grief that tore through Innovate Dynamics was real and deep. People were openly crying in the hallways. The family she had built was now a family in mourning. The funeral was a few days later. It was supposed to be a celebration of her life, a final farewell to a titan. But for some, it was just a networking event. As I stood there, trying to wrap my head around the loss, I watched Richard and his crew. They weren't mourning, they were maneuvering. I saw him, his face a perfect mask of fake sadness, whispering excitedly with Marcus and Janice, near the back of the chapel. They weren't sharing condolences. They were confirming allegiances. Later, at the wake, their whispers got bolder. I was standing by a window when I overheard Richard talking to an investor. His voice was low, but you could hear the predatory excitement underneath. "It's a tragedy, of course," he said, the words completely hollow. "But we have to look to the future. The company needs strong, decisive leadership to navigate this transition. The last thing we need is a power vacuum." He had no idea I was standing right there. That phrase, power vacuum, hit me like a punch to the gut. Eleanor was barely gone, and he was already talking about seizing her throne. Then Janice Croft chimed in, her voice like ice. "We've scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday to discuss the path forward. We need to reassure the market and stabilize the ship." Stabilize the ship? They were planning to hijack it. It was the most disgusting display of disrespect I had ever seen. They saw Eleanor's death not as a tragedy, but as their one big shot. Her life's work was just a prize to be snatched. Cold fury just surged through me, pushing past the grief. I wanted to march over there and call them out for the ghouls they were. But what could I do? I was the head of R&D. I had Eleanor's respect, sure, but in the cold math of corporate power, I was just a high-level employee. I had no board seat, no shares, no real power to stop them. I left the wake feeling completely helpless. The company Eleanor had poured her soul into was about to be devoured by the very people she'd held off for years. They were going to tear down her legacy, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do. I barely slept that night, just replaying their smug faces, their hushed words. The meeting was in 2 days. 2 days until Richard Sterling sat in Eleanor's chair and started desecrating her life's work. It felt like the darkest moment. But what I didn't know was that Eleanor had already made one last move. A final, brilliant play from beyond the grave. The next morning, I got a call from a man named Arthur Kensington, Eleanor's personal attorney. His voice was somber, but there was an urgency to it. "Alex," he said. Eleanor's final instructions were very clear. "I need to see you. Today. It's a matter of the utmost importance regarding her estate and the future of Innovate Dynamics." I met him at his quiet, wood-paneled office downtown. It felt like a world away from the corporate Shark Tank. Arthur was an older gentleman with kind eyes that looked like they'd seen it all. He'd been Eleanor's lawyer and friend for over 30 years. He motioned for me to sit as he unlocked a heavy safe and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "Alex," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "Eleanor thought of you as family. She trusted you more than anyone. She knew the character of the men on her board. She knew exactly what they would try to do the second she was gone." He slid the envelope across the polished desk. Her last will and testament. My hands were shaking a little as I took it. "Turn to page 5, section 3, Arthur said gently. I found the page. It was dense with legalese, but Arthur translated. Eleanor was a brilliant strategist, Alex. For years, she held all her personal shares in a private trust. No one on the board knew the exact percentage she controlled. They just assumed it was significant, but not overwhelming. He let that sink in for a moment. She spent the last few years quietly consolidating her position through third-party acquisitions. She never wanted to use it as a weapon. She wanted the company run on the merit of ideas, but she always had a contingency plan. My eyes scanned the text, and then I saw it. The words that changed everything. My breath caught in my throat. And so I bequeathed the entirety of my shares in the Vance Family Trust, constituting 51% of the total voting shares of Innovate Dynamics, to my trusted friend and colleague, Alex Reyes. 51%. I read it again, and a third time. The number practically floated off the page. It wasn't just a lot of shares. It was everything. It was absolute control. It was the company. I was the new majority shareholder. I looked up at Arthur, completely speechless. My mind was reeling. Me. I finally whispered. Why me? Because, Arthur said, his voice soft but firm, she knew you were the only one who would protect her legacy. The only one who loved the company for what it was, not what it could be stripped and sold for. Alex, this isn't just a gift. It's a responsibility. She just handed you a sword and a shield. The shock slowly gave way to a dawning, electrifying clarity. The helplessness that had been crushing me for 2 days just evaporated. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. Richard's smug face flashed in my mind. His talk of a power vacuum. Their emergency meeting. They were about to walk into that boardroom, thinking they held all the cards, totally clueless that the throne had already been given away. The plan formed in my mind almost instantly. I could have called them. Arthur could have sent an official notice and blown up their meeting before it even started. But that wasn't right. That wasn't Eleanor's style. She always believed in letting people show you who they really are. They don't know, I said, my voice steady now. Richard and the board have no idea. None, Arthur confirmed. Per Eleanor's instructions, the transfer is effective immediately, but it isn't public record yet. Right now, you are the silent majority owner of Innovate Dynamics. This was perfect. Their emergency meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m., I said. They're planning to appoint Richard as interim CEO. Arthur nodded, a faint smile on his lips. A plan that will be dead on arrival the moment you object. Good, I said, standing up. I'm not stopping their meeting. I'm going to attend it. I want to hear exactly what they have to say. I want to see just how far they're willing to go when they think no one can stop them. I was going to their meeting, not as Alex Reyes, the grieving head of R&D, but as Alex Reyes, the emergency. Eleanor hadn't just left me a company. She had left me a weapon, and I was about to walk right into the heart of their conspiracy and use it. The thought of the look on Richard Sterling's face was more than enough to get me through the next 24 hours. The next morning, the air on the executive floor was thick with tension. You could feel it, the quiet hum of a coup in progress. People kept their heads down, sensing a power shift, whispering to each other. They knew a change was coming. They just didn't know what kind. I walked through the halls, my face a neutral mask. Just one of them, another employee worried about the future. No one knew I was carrying that future in a folder under my arm. I showed up to the boardroom, 5 minutes late. On purpose. I wanted them settled, fully immersed in their own self-importance. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, all conversation stopped. 11 pairs of eyes snapped to me. Richard was at the head of the table, in Eleanor's chair, just like I'd pictured. He looked annoyed. Alex, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a closed board meeting. Your presence isn't required. Janice Croft smirked. We're discussing high-level strategy, Alex. This is a bit above your pay grade. I know what you're discussing, I said calmly. I walked further into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't take a seat against the wall, like an observer. I walked right to the empty chair beside Richard, a seat reserved for senior board members, and placed my folder on the table. Richard's annoyance flared into anger. What do you think you're doing? This is for board members and key stakeholders only. I know, I said, looking him dead in the eye. That's why I'm here. I am the key stakeholder. A ripple of confusion went around the room. Marcus Thorne, the lawyer, leaned forward. Alex, with all due respect, you're an employee. A valued one, yes, but still an employee. You don't have a stake in this company. That's where you're wrong, Marcus. My voice dropped a little, and I let the silence hang in the air. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. The whole dynamic in the room was already starting to tremble. As you all know, I continued, speaking to the entire room, Eleanor Vance dedicated her life to this company. She was a brilliant strategist, always 5 steps ahead. Even now. I opened the folder. Inside was a single document, a certified copy of the final page of Eleanor's will. "You called this meeting to fill a power vacuum," I said, my eyes landing on Richard, then Janice, then Marcus. "You plan to use this tragedy to install your own leadership and change the direction of this company, a direction Eleanor fought against for years." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You have no authority. Security." "Don't bother," I said, my voice cutting through his tantrum. "They won't be necessary. You see, Richard, Eleanor made sure there would be no power vacuum. She made sure her legacy was protected. She put a succession plan in place, a plan none of you knew about." I slid the document down the polished table. It stopped right in front of him. I watched his face as he read. I saw it all, the confusion, the disbelief, the flush of angry red, and then the blood draining from his face as the cold, hard truth hit him like a freight train. I saw the exact moment he understood. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "For those of you who can't see it," I announced to the stunned room, "let me read from the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance. I bequeath the entirety of my shares in the Vance Family Trust, constituting 51% of the total voting shares of Innovate Dynamics, to my trusted friend and colleague, Alex Reyes." Silence. A deep, profound silence. The vultures were frozen, their grand plans turning to ash. The other board members just stared, their faces a mix of shock and dawning realization. The power in the room hadn't just shifted, it had imploded. They were no longer a board of directors staging a takeover. They were employees waiting for instructions from the new owner. 51%, I repeated slowly. That means I have majority control. That means I have the deciding vote on everything. Board composition, executive appointments, strategic direction. Everything. Janice was the first to find her voice, a strangled whisper. This can't be legal." "Oh, it's perfectly legal," I said, glancing at Marcus. "Isn't that right, Marcus? As company counsel, you can confirm that a majority shareholder can veto any board resolution and appoint new directors at will. Or should I have my personal attorney explain it to you?" Marcus, the man who'd been advising the takeover, suddenly looked sick. He knew the law. He knew he was beaten. He just gave a slight, mute nod, refusing to meet my eyes. I turned back to Richard. He was still staring at the paper, his face a mask of utter ruin. "So," I said, my voice calm and deliberate, "let's talk about your agenda." Item 1 was the appointment of a new interim CEO. I paused. "I vote no." Item 2, I continued, was a proposal to restructure R&D, which is a nice way of saying you plan to gut my team and sell off our projects. I vote no. Item 3 was a plan to merge with a competitor known for hostile takeovers and mass layoffs. I vote no. I stood up and closed my folder. In fact, this meeting is over. As the majority shareholder, I am officially adjourning it. I looked at the shell-shocked faces around the table. A new board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. The agenda will have one item, discussing the future of Innovate Dynamics under new ownership. Attendance is mandatory. I looked directly at Richard, Janice, and Marcus, and I suggest you come prepared to offer your resignations. Your vision for this company is no longer relevant. As of now, Eleanor's vision is the only one that matters. I turned and walked out, leaving a bomb crater of a boardroom behind me. The vultures hadn't just been outplayed. They had been completely and publicly annihilated. They thought they were staging a takeover, but they were just auditioning for their own firing. As the door clicked shut behind me, I heard the first sound of the fallout. Richard's sputtering, incoherent rage. It was the sound of a tyrant realizing he was no longer king. And it was the sound of victory. If you've ever fantasized about getting that kind of justice against a power-hungry boss, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that you want to see more stories where the right people win. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The power vacuum Richard was so desperate to fill was now occupied by an authority he couldn't possibly challenge. He did not take it well. He stormed out of the boardroom after me, screaming about lawsuits. He spent the rest of the day on the phone with his own lawyers, frantically searching for a loophole or an angle to challenge the will. He found nothing. Eleanor and Arthur had built an ironclad document. By evening, his threats had fizzled out into bitter, powerless silence. The rest of the board fell into two camps. First, there were the rats, Janice and Marcus. Of course, Janice sent me a groveling email about her deep respect for Eleanor and how Richard had forced her hand. It was pathetic. Marcus tried to schedule a private meeting to offer his undying loyalty. Their spinelessness was almost impressive. Then there were the others, the board members who had just been passively swept along by Richard's agenda. They were wary, but mostly they seemed relieved. One of them, an older gentleman named George, who had been on the board for years, called me. "Alex," he said, his voice tired but sincere, "thank God it's you." We were heading down a very dark path. Eleanor would be proud. My first official act was to send a company-wide email. I didn't need to air the dirty laundry about the takeover attempt. I simply announced that, per Eleanor's final wishes, I had inherited her controlling stake and was stepping in as acting CEO. I promised everyone that Innovate Dynamics would continue to operate on the principles Eleanor had established: innovation, integrity, and a commitment to our people. The response was overwhelming. The fear that had been hanging over the office just evaporated, replaced by this incredible wave of relief and support. My inbox was flooded with messages from everyone, from junior engineers to department heads, all saying how happy they were that the company was in the hands of someone who actually got it. The board meeting the next morning was a totally different world. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber, professional quiet. I sat at the head of the table in Eleanor's chair. This time it felt right. Richard, Janice, and Marcus sat there, looking like ghosts. "This board needs a new direction," I began. "One that's fully aligned with our founding vision." I then called for a vote of no confidence in Richard Sterling as chairman. With my 51%, the outcome was a formality. The motion passed. I then accepted his resignation, followed by Janice's and Marcus's. They were gone by lunchtime. The era of the vultures was over. In their place, I nominated 3 new board members. Not corporate raiders, but people who understood the company's soul. I nominated our brilliant head of engineering, our head of HR who'd been with us for 15 years, and George, the board member who'd shown he had a spine. The weeks that followed were all about stabilizing the ship and reaffirming who we were. I immediately reversed Richard's quiet budget cuts to our long-term research projects. I met with every single team, listening to their ideas and their concerns. I made it crystal clear that Innovate Dynamics was not for sale. Our future wasn't in being dismantled, but in growing and honoring the legacy of the woman who built this place. I never moved into Eleanor's office. It's still there, just as she left it a memorial. I took the smaller office next door. My job isn't to replace her, it's to continue her work. I'm not the visionary she was, but I am her student. I'm the guardian of her legacy. It's an immense weight, but it's a weight I'm proud to carry. They thought they could take over the company. They saw death as an opening, but they totally underestimated the loyalty Eleanor inspired, and they never saw her final move coming. She may be gone, but her will prevails. I'll spend the rest of my career making sure it always does. So that's how it happened. That's how a boardroom full of predators, ready to carve up a company, was stopped dead by a piece of paper and the unbreakable will of a great leader. They thought power came from titles and intimidation. They learned the hard way that true, lasting power comes from loyalty, from vision, and from a legacy so strong it can reach back from beyond the grave to protect itself. Richard and his friends wanted to own a company. I was given the responsibility to lead one. In the end, that made all the difference. Thanks for listening. The world is full of people like Richard, but it's also full of people like Eleanor. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and maybe share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the good guys can and do win. And please share your own stories of justice in the comments. I read all of them, and they remind me why we fight these battles in the first place. Until next time, ***.